my parents got divorced when I was 10, and so I went to live in Pennsylvania with my mother, who got custody of me, and she cultivated the Hammersteins, and they had a son my age. And so by the time I went to George School, which I was 13, I was already interested in imitating Oscar. He was a surrogate father. I liked my father a lot. He was a swell fellow, but I didn't see him very often because my mother was bitter about him and did everything she could to prevent me from seeing him. He remarried, and I used to have to sneak off to see them because I didn't know, but my mother was lying to me about how often I could see him. But so it was very unpleasant. But so Oscar was a surrogate father during all those many days and weeks and months when I didn't see my own father. I wrote a show at George School called By George, and it was all about local campus activities. But I was 15. I thought it was so terrific that I was sure that Rogers and Hammerstein, who were producers as well as writers, would want to produce it immediately, and I would be the youngest songwriter on Broadway. I asked him if he would read it, and he said sure, and so he called me the next day, and I went over, and I said, now, I want you to really treat this like a professional, don't, as if you didn't know me, as if it just crossed your desk. And he said, all right. In that case, it's the worst thing that ever crossed my desk. And I was shocked, and he knew how disappointed I was, to put it mildly. He said, "No, I didn't say it wasn't talented." He said, "But if you want to go through it, I'll tell you what's wrong with it." And he started right from the first stage direction, and he treated me like an adult. He treated me as if I were a professional. And by the end of the afternoon, I was on my way to being a professional. It was a long afternoon. Well, it was probably 2.5 hours, but the packed information I got in, and at that age, you're a sponge. You absorb everything. So and he gave me the distillation of 30 years of experience. Now, not all in that afternoon, because then he set up a course for me, so to speak. He said, if you want to learn to write musicals, why don't you take a good play, one that you like, and make it into a musical. And then, after you've done that, then take a play that you like but you think is flawed, and see if you can improve it and turn it into a musical. Then take a story, not one that you've written, but that is not in the dramatic form, like a novel or something like that, make it into a musical, and then make up your own story and make it into a musical. And he said, by the time you get all those 4 done, you'll know something. And that's exactly what I did. When I was 17, he was going to, it was their third show. They'd written Oklahoma Carousel, Rodgers and Hammerstein. And Oscar asked me if I'd like to work on it because they were rehearsing over the summer, which was between college terms for me. So that's exactly what I did. I was a gopher, fetched coffee and typed a script. And he just wanted me to inculcate my, self. And I learned a great deal watching, because particularly the show was highly experimental, and it was a failure. And both those things were very important to me, because one of the things I learned was to be brave, and the other thing, not to expect that everything's going to come out perfectly. Also, it was very, very much hurt by the director, Agnes DeMille, and I learned something about got to watch out for directors. The audience sat there in dead silence for the first half hour, because the reviews from out of town had made it sound like some kind of masterpiece. And so the audience was awestruck when they came in, instead of remembering that they were at a musical. And so there was virtually no response. They just sat there as at a temple. And then America came on, and Cheetah Rivera lifted her skirts and danced all over the stage, and the audience suddenly were reminded they were at a musical. And from then on, they had a very good time. We hired Glynis Johns on playing the lead. On the though she had a nice little silvery voice, but I put all the vocal weight of the show on the other characters, because we needed somebody who was glamorous, charming, and could play light comedy and pretty. And to find that in combination with a good voice is very unlikely. And but she had all the right qualities and a nice little voice. So I didn't write much for her, and I didn't write anything in the second act. And the big scene between her and her ex-lover, I had started on a song for him because it's his scene. And Hal Prince, who directed it, said he thought that the second act needed a song for her. And this was the scene to do it in. And so he directed the scene in such a way that even though the dramatic thrust comes from the man's monologue, and she just sits there and reacts, he directed so you could feel the weight going to her reaction rather than his action. And I went down and saw it, and it seemed very clear what was needed, and so that made it very easy to write. And then I wrote it for her voice because she couldn't sustain notes, so because it wasn't that kind of singing voice. So I knew I had to write things in short, sharp, short phrases, and that led to questions, and that, you know. So it was, again, I wouldn't have written the song so quickly if I hadn't known the actress. I wrote most of it one night, and finished. I did the part of the second chorus. I'd gotten the ending. I don't remember. Anyway, the whole thing was done in 2 days. It wasn't a hit for 2 years. I mean, the first person to sing was Bobby Short, who happened to see the show in Boston, and it was exactly his kind of song. He's a cabaret entertainer. And then my memory is that Judy Collins picked it up, but recorded it in England. Sinatra heard it and recorded it, and between the two of them, they made a hit. When I wrote Small World in Gypsy, Julie Stein, the composer, was very upset because he said, this can only be sung by a woman, and my friend Frank needs a song, Sinatra. That's the way he thought, because he'd come from a generation in which you put the song in the musical. If it worked for the story, great, but the important thing was that it should get recorded. By that time, you know, hit songs did not come out of musicals. By that time, rock was creating the hits. There were very, 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 very few songs that made the charts in any way out of any Broadway musical. No matter what a big, there was no hit from Fiddler on the Roof. Hello, Dolly may have been the only one, and so one didn't think in those terms. In the generation before me, the Rogers and Hammerstein generation, that's why they plugged the song in Oklahoma, because popular hits came out of shows and movies. And this was no longer true, so, which was a great liberation because it meant you could write about anything. I started listening to classical music when I was in my early teens. Prior to that, I listened to pop records or band records because my father liked that kind of music, and I particularly liked watching. We had a K-part phonograph, which was a very elaborate mechanism in which 78s, which were recorded 3 minutes on a side, and so you had to turn them over by hand. But this machine turned the record over by a very clever mechanical device, and I used to just watch it, and I think that's how I got into music. I also took piano lessons when I was 6 years old, but I don't remember being, quote, moved by a piece of music first. My father played piano by ear. My mother was non-musical. She was visual. And my father would play, he loved Broadway shows, and he would come home and approximate the songs on the piano, and he would put his hands on the keys, and he put my hand, when I was tiny, on the melody, because he always played the melody with his little finger in the top. And so that was my exposure to piano. I took piano lessons when I was 6 and 7, but that's because what every nice upper middle class Jewish boy did in New York City. And so it was really, so the parents could show me off to their guests and playing Flight of the Bumblebee and that sort of thing. And then I didn't want to go on with it, and then I played the organ when I went to military school when I was 10 years old. They had a huge, in fact, I believe it was the second largest pipe organ in New York State. And I loved all the buttons and the gadgets because I've always been a gadget man. My feet could hardly hit the pedals, but I played, and that was fun for a year. And then I took piano lessons when I was in prep school when I was 15 and 16, and 14 and 15, and gave recitals around Pennsylvania. And but but I was not. They wanted me to be a concert pianist because I have a very good right hand, but my left hand's terrible, and I hated performing. Loved it. No, my parents got divorced, and military school gave me a structure. They sent me off. That's uh, my class of kids, and I think a lot of kids my age at that point were children of divorced parents who didn't know what to do with the kids. So I liked it a lot. That always surprises people. But I liked knowing that I had to be here at 10:03 and do that at 11:07 and that sort of thing. Math was my big interest when I was in prep school. Although I didn't, I took some math courses there, and I was considering taking math in college and majoring in it. But since I didn't really want to be a mathematician, I thought so. I went to a liberal arts college, Williams, and so I just took liberal arts courses. Anagrams is a game that, in its original form, has a set of protocols in which you form words out of a pool of letters, but you're supposed to wait until the person whose turn it is gives up, and then you can say, "I see a word." But in Cutthroat, you don't wait for anybody. You just turn the letter up, and everybody yells whatever word they see. And that was something I learned. I'd been playing anagrams. I was brought up, by Oscar Hammerstein in my early teens, and he liked anagrams, but it was the decorous kind. And then when I met Leonard Bernstein, he and his family played cutthroat anagrams, and that's how I got into that. Art in itself is an attempt to, bring order out of chaos, and certainly puzzles. The nice thing about doing a crossword puzzle is there is a solution. I also like murder mysteries for the same reason. Again, the puzzle murder mysteries, the Agatha Christie kinds of things, where that it's all going to be neatly wound up at the end and everything's going to make logical sense. And I think that's why murder mysteries are popular. It's a defense against chaos. The Oz books. That's what I read. I was never much of a reader, and so much so that when I got to college, I took every novel course I could get my hands on to try to get into the habit of reading. And to this day, I'm just not a reader. I'm a slow reader, which is unusual because I'm so into language and I love words so much, but it's hard for me to read. My mother wanted me off her hands. She was a working woman, and she designed clothes. And she was a celebrity collector, and they had a son my age. So, I mean, there are a series of circumstances that come together. It's not so much luck, it's my mother's ambition to be a celebrity. And her maiden name was Janet Fox. Yeah. She was a very talented dress designer, and my father was a dress manufacturer. I have a feeling that marriage was one of convenience. I think she was in love with him, but I don't think he felt about her the way she did about him. And it's all speculation, the way I look back on it. She was a difficult woman, and I don't think he was very happy with being married to her. Oh, goodness. Virtually everything. Structure, don't forget his particular, people mistake or underestimate what he did in the way of musical theater. He was primarily an experimental writer. And what he was doing was marrying the traditions of opera and American musical comedy, using songs to tell a story that was worth telling. It was the first real instance of that is Showboat, which is a watershed show in terms of the history of musical theater. And Oklahoma, which is in the same way, though in different ways, I should say, innovative. But it's only one way of writing songs. He believed in dramatic songwriting. So what I learned from him was, how to tell a story in song, which is not what Cole Porter was doing or Rodgers and Hart. There are other ways to write songs and other uses of them. Now, because of the success of Oklahoma and subsequent shows, most musical theater now tells stories through songs. But that was not true prior to 1943, and it was the year of Oklahoma. So he was teaching me, but he also taught me how to structure a song. He taught me the use of a rhyme, and everything, and about character. Well, inconsistencies, what is effective on a stage, concision, all kinds of things. He was technically, very, very good. His writing today particularly seems somewhat naive, but not if you look at it technically, and certainly not from the use of the imagination. His imagination, his creative imagination was far more sophisticated than the work itself, and has affected the theater permanently. His kind of lyric writing was very much understated lyric writing. His lyrics don't read very well. They sing when they're good, they sing great. But whereas if you read Cole Porter's, they're very entertaining. Oh, What a Beautiful Morning simply, when you put it on paper, looks vapid, but it's not when it's sung. That's another thing he understood, which is how rich music is, and lyrics have to be underwritten. That's why poets generally make poor lyric writers. Not always, but generally they do, because the language is too rich. It's like what they call in England egging the, goodness, I can't remember what the noun is. Not egging the cake, but it's over enriching something so that you get drowned in it instead of, I firmly believe the lyrics have to breathe and give the audience a chance and give the audience's ear a chance to understand what's going on. Well, particularly in the theater where you not only have the music, but you've got costume, story, acting, orchestra, there's a lot to take in. And if the lyrics are too packed, the whole idea of poetry is denseness, is concision, is abutment of images and that sort of thing. You can't do that when you've got music going and expect the audience to take it in. I've never been a fan of Lawrence Hart's lyrics, Rodinard, because I find them lazy and forced. But he would defend, and there are people who care about the musical theater argue, some of them, that that Rodgers and Hart was much better than Rodgers and Hammerstein. That's all simplistic, and Hart and Rodgers were so sophisticated. And Oscar, on the other hand, used to defend Lawrence Hart to me, and he said, Hart was one of the very first to try to make natural speech a part of lyric writing, so that it sounded conversational. And he's right. He's not exactly a pioneer, but he was certainly one of the first. By the time I'd done the 4 musicals that Oscar had sort of urged me to do, I was, I was really at the age of 22 a professional, a young and flawed professional, but not an amateur. And there was a play called Front Porch and Flatbush that had never been produced. It was going to be produced by a man named Lemuel Ayres, who had a huge success recently producing and designing Kiss Me Kate and a couple of other things, but that was his big hit. And so he wanted to produce this as a musical. It takes place in Brooklyn in 1928, this play, and it was written by 2 brothers who were primarily screenwriters, Philip and Julius Epstein. And they'd written about their childhood and about their own brother, a third brother, who was something of a scapegrace. And so Lem had approached, I think, Frank Lesser and somebody else, and they turned him down. And I happened to meet Lem. We were ushers at a wedding together. And he asked to hear some songs, and so I played him some songs I'd written. And he commissioned me to try 3 songs for this thing, which was to be retitled. And Julie Epstein came in from California. And I got the job. I came out to California and worked with Julie out here for 5 months, staying at Lem's house. Lem was designing a movie. And then, and then we went back east and we did 8 backers auditions, and we raised about half the money. And then Lem died. He was, unbeknownst to me and to most people around him, he had leukemia. And he died at an early age, early 40s. And the rights passed to his widow, Shirley, and she wanted to go on with it, but she had no experience, and she couldn't do it. So the show never came to fruition. But it was a professional score, and now I had a real portfolio to play. So that's the importance of that show to me. My first job, paying job, was here in California as an assistant writer to a man named George Oppenheimer on a TV series called Topper. And George had a friend named Martin Gable, who was an actor and a producer in New York, and Martin Gable and a guy named Henry Margulies were going to produce. They they were going to produce a musical of the James Cain novel Serenade. It was originally to have been written by Bernstein and directed by Jerry Robbins and a book by Arthur Lawrence. But Warner Brothers came out with the movie. They had the rights, so however it worked. So the project had been dropped. No, as a matter of fact, no, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Bernstein and Robbins had dropped out. George Oppenheimer, they were looking for a composer. George brought me up to Marty's house, and I played the score Saturday night, or some of the songs anyway. Arthur Lawrence was to be the book writer, so he heard the songs. Then, shortly afterwards, Warner Brothers announced their plans to do it, so the project was dropped. But Arthur had heard my stuff. And then, many months later, I was at an opening night party that Bert Shevloff had invited me to. That's the man who wrote Forum, and was a good friend. He had been to the opening. I didn't go, but he said, if you'd like to go to the opening night party afterwards, show up at such and such an apartment. And so I did, and I got there before Bert, so I didn't know anybody, except suddenly there was this familiar face, was Arthur Lawrence. And we chatted just to make small talk. And I asked him what he was doing. He said he was about to start on a musical version of Romeo and Juliet. And I said, who's writing? He said, Leonard Bernstein. And he said, I think, Betty and Adolph, meaning Comden and Green, except we can't, they're not sure they can get out of a Hollywood contract. We'll know in a week. And he said, I never thought of you. If they don't do, would you like to audition for Bernstein? Because I loved your lyrics. He said, I didn't like your music very much. He said, it's Saturday night, but I loved your lyrics. He said, and I said, sure. And I didn't really want to write just lyrics, but I wanted to meet Leonard Bernstein. And so I met him the next day, and I played for him. And he said, I'll call you in a week and let you know about Comden and Green. First of all, I assumed that Comden and Green would be able easily to get out of their contract. And secondly, I didn't want to write just lyrics. Because music was always my first reason I was writing songs. And sure enough, the phone rang. And I said, let me get back to you. And I went to Oscar and said, I really just want to write music. But he said, take the job. He said, first of all, these are really experienced and talented men, Bernstein and Robbins and Lawrence, and you'll learn a lot, and so you'll write music later. And that's exactly what I did, and his advice was very good. It depends what account you read. The point is that he wanted to do Romeo and Juliet because I think he was coaching Montgomery Clift in a scene or something. He got the idea of doing Romeo and Juliet and to do it between Catholics and Jews on the Lower East Side, and he enlisted Arthur and Leine, and Arthur felt that, this is Arthur's account anyway, that it would just be A.B.'s Irish Rose set to music. And so then they were all out here in California, apparently sitting around the Beverly Hills pool, and they picked up a newspaper, and there was a headline about gang warfare in New York and Puerto Rican street gangs. And the figurative light went on or something like that, and they decided, I don't know what the gap of years was between that and when they started writing, but that then became the genesis. Lenny wanted to write lyrics too, and he was afraid of taking a chance on an unknown, so we worked together. But by the time we opened in Washington, all the lyrics were mine with one or two line exception. And so he very generously took his name off the lyric writers list. There was 4% of the gross for lyrics and music. And it was in those days there was 6% for book music and lyrics, 2, 2, and 2. In point of fact, because Bernstein and Lawrence and Robbins had such clout, it was a slightly larger percentage. And Leine, for the music and lyrics, there was 4%. Leine was to get 3, I was to get 1, and Leine said, we'll even out because you deserve blah, blah, blah. And I foolishly said, oh, don't be silly, all I care about is the credit. Somebody should have stuffed a handkerchief in my mouth because it would have been nice to get that extra percent. Fun, a lot of fun, and we had numerous shared tastes, particularly British crossword puzzles, which in fact I introduced him to, and anagrams. We played cutthroat anagrams, which was the way we'd get off any kind of hidden hostility. It was never any overt hostility at all, and he liked working with somebody who knew music, who was a musician. He had never written with somebody who was a musician before, and so the main difference was he liked to work together in a room, and I liked to work separately. So we compromised. We were separate for 2 days, and then we'd get together on the third day. We talked on the phone a lot. It could not have been a better and more stimulating and good collaboration. A great time. He was conducting, but he was to take over the Philharmonic in the fall of '57. And we had intended to go into rehearsal in July, so there would be no problem, no conflict. But, actually, we intended to go earlier than that, sorry. But the producer, Cheryl Crawford, dropped out at the last minute. She'd been the putative producer for over a year, but she suddenly got cold feet. And so there we were, knowing that we had to get the show on by September because Leine was unavailable starting in September. And so I had urged them to give the show earlier to Hal Prince and his partner Bobby Griffith, but though they had done 2 successful shows, Pajama Game and Damn Yankees, Leine and Jerry and Arthur didn't feel that they were experienced enough, so they preferred Cheryl. When Cheryl dropped out, I called Hal myself, who was out of town with a show called New Girl in Town, which was not going well. And so he was more than anxious to start a new project. However, I had played him the score before, and he did not like the show, West Side. But because of that moment, catching him in the vulnerable thing in the last couple of weeks in Boston, and knowing that the minute the show opened in New York, he would have something else to work on, it softened him up. They're very self-conscious lyrics. You can smell the writer. They're instead of the characters. They're coming from the writer. Now the whole play, and the book, which I think is brilliant because of how much it accomplishes in such a brief time, is also arch. I mean, it's very stylized language. So I was justified, but as I said before about lyrics, music blows lyrics up very quickly. And suddenly they become more than art. They become pompous and they become self-conscious. I like Something's Coming, and I like the Jets song and a couple of other moments, but that's about it. Leine was away. We'd finished the song Maria, and I went up to play it for Jerry, and Jerry said, well, after he'd heard it, he said, well, yeah, that's all fine, but what's he doing? I said, what do you mean, what's he doing? He said, what's the character doing? I said, he's singing a song. I mean, he's standing there like you do in musicals, and you sing a song. He said, well, how would you like to stage it? He said, because he was always quite hostile. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, tell me, stage it. Tell me what. I said, well, and I realized what he was saying, is that there should be some kind of stage action built into a song, that you should, as a songwriter, choreograph it yourself in some way, even if it's just a so-called static love song. And it was a very important lesson. I've always done that, which is why directors like working with me, because I always give them a blueprint from which they can either ignore, or from which they can use as a springboard. But there's always a blueprint. I never say, well, here's the number. I would say, here, he's sitting on a chair, he gets up, he pours himself a cup of coffee, he sings the first, whatever it is. And often, particularly when I worked with Hal Prince, I would get the dimensions of the set, so I would know how long it took a character to get from X to Y, and write accordingly, so the director isn't suddenly stuck with saying, I need 8 more bars. I did my senior thesis, or junior thesis, I guess, in college on the Ravel Left Pan Piano Concerto. I've always been a fan of his. And I did my senior thesis on the Copland Music for the Theater. I've always been a fan of his, so My music probably has less evidence of Copland in it than it does of Ravel. But no, there are certain composers whose music I love, like Stravinsky and Britten and Ravel, Rachmaninoff, and they show up all the time in my stuff. He was at the sort of the end of his um, creative career. It was very difficult working with him because he was afraid to rewrite. He was afraid that he'd reach the bottom of the well. And, I'm one of those believers that that writing is a matter of rewriting. And if he would resist any change in a song, and because he was afraid that if he tried to rewrite something, he'd come up empty. He was a very paranoid man, so that was another problem because Arthur and I were great friends. We collaborated a lot, Arthur Lawrence, and it was based on a play of Arthur's. Rogers was the producer, so he had the whip hand, and so it became this kind of feud, which it only surfaced as such a few times, but it was always there. When I first started work with him, he had a great time working with me because, again, I was a musician, and he had never worked with a musician. And so we had a common language. And the kind of lyrics I was writing had an echo of heart in them because they were kind of hip. But the story's a sentimental one. And and over a period of time, and particularly when we got out of town and the show didn't work very well, and then he went berserk. Oh, at one point he tore up a lyric of mine that I'd worked 36 hours on in front of the whole cast and called it a piece of shit. I'd written the show Anyone Can Whistle, which only lasted 9 performances, but I liked the show. Forum had been a big hit. That was my first show with music on Broadway. And then came Do I Hear Waltz after Whistle. I thought I'd be devastated the first time I had a big flop, but I wasn't. You're disappointed. And it sounds mealy-mouthed to say, but it's true. My main disappointment is that people I want to see it aren't going to get a chance to see it. That's my main disappointment. Musicals are, particularly musicals, plays also, but musicals particularly are the last collaborator is your audience, and so you got to wait till the last collaborator comes in before you can complete the collaboration. And when the audience comes in, it changes the temperature of what you've written. And things that seemed to work well work in the sense of carry the story forward and be integral to the piece, suddenly become a little less relevant or a little less functional or a little overlong or a little overweight or a little whatever. And so you start reshaping in front of an audience. That's something I learned from Oscar. He and Rogers had written a ballad for Oklahoma called Boys and Girls Like You and Me. And they played it in the overture, and they sang it in the first act, and they did it in the entr'acte, and then they reprised it in the second act. It was their big plug number to be a popular hit. And they dropped it in New Haven because it didn't serve the function in the show that it could, and that's ruthlessness. And I learned that from Oscar. What happens is when you're out of town, out of town is what it amounts to, although that one was written during rehearsals, or in rehearsals, you know your cast well, and you know their strengths and weaknesses, and you can start writing for them, just the way Shakespeare wrote for his actors. And I've said with heavy humor that I really don't want to write a score until the whole show is cast and staged, because that's why so many good songs get written out of town and written fast, because you know exactly what's missing, you know exactly what has to work or happen, you know exactly who you're writing for, you know exactly what the audience is starting to feel. It's all, and so the more restrictions you have, the easier anything is to write. And when you're out of town and you're restricted by all those factors, it's much easier to write than when you just have a tabula rasa and say, gee, well, we got to have a love song here. It's not the same thing. The way you get into the character, the way you get into the song, both musically and lyrically, is to become the character. It's the only way. I don't know how else you do it, unless you're the playwright who created the character in the first place. But I'm always writing for characters that somebody else has created, my collaborator. And so the only way I can get into I've said, and it's probably an exaggeration, but not much, that by the time I get through writing a score, I know the book better than the book writer does, because I've examined every word and questioned the book writer on every word. Why does she say this? Why doesn't she say that? And that's getting to know the character. And then writing the song is acting it. You know. So I can start ad-libbing. It's exactly like improvisatory acting. So here's the character Blanche. We're hiring you to play Blanche. Okay, just veer from the Tennessee Williams script and just start ad-libbing as Blanche. If you're thoroughly in the character, you can do it. You may not have the poetry he has, but everything you say will be in the character of Blanche. That's what I do. I take off from what the book writer has written, and sometimes using a line of his as a springboard, and ad-lib and improvise as that character. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I talk, for weeks to the book writer. I always talk for weeks before doing any writing, and just to discuss just such matters. But sometimes I'll ask the book writer to write a monologue, not to be performed, just as if they were notes for the character, and then because nobody knows the characters better than the guy who creates them. What's innovative about Company is it blends two traditional forms for the first time, the review and the book show. It's review, but it tells a story. It doesn't have a plot, but it has a story. Reviews up to that time were just collections of songs by the songwriters, that whole generation, Rodgers and Hart, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, they all wrote reviews, just collections of their songs. Sometimes with a theme, as Thousands Cheer, which was a review, but each number was preceded by a headline from the newspapers. But nobody had ever tried to blend the two. And we didn't try, it's just that George Firth had written these one-act plays, and Hal thought they would, George he was supposed to go in rehearsal. There was a production set. It fell apart. He said, "What shall I do with the plays?" I said, "Hal will know what to do with the plays. He's really good at this sort of thing." And so George sent the plays to Hal, and to our surprise, Hal said, "I think they'd make a musical." And so we sat and tried to figure out how to tie these disparate plays together. But George had unconsciously written all these plays, not unconsciously, because the production was to use the same three actors for all the plays. Each play that he'd written, and they're short plays, was a couple and an outside figure. Varying ages, varying sexes. It wasn't always the guy who was the outsider. And we suddenly, in examining them, realized that you could use that outsider as the central character and have all these plays. And about 2.5 of those plays are still in the show, and the others were written specifically for Company. And that's what it is. It's a collection of playlets, but they're held together by a character who changes or who observes and who is not just like an MC, but somebody who is integrated into all these plays and then turns out to be the leading character. The primary thing about Hal, for me, is his enthusiasm and impatience. I'm a low flame, and he's a high flame. And that's one of the things that makes us a good team. Coming away from any meeting with Hal or a discussion on the phone or anything like that, I always want to write. And in the case of Company, some of the shows I did with Hal, he was very much responsible for the building and the growth of the show. Some were just shows like Sweeney Todd or Night Music were just shows that were sort of brought to him. But Company, Folly was brought to him, but Jim Goldman and I brought it to him, but then he had a take on how to stage it, which then affected the writing. So the thing is, it's primarily about stimulation. And of course, it's theatrical imagination. I mean, apart from that, there's the skill too, but in terms of the personal. The idea of the pervasion of the ghosts, that came about because James and I, because we had limited, obviously, theatrical imagination, we were afraid of flashbacks because, you suddenly have to, the scenery comes on and all that. Hal said, there's no need. He said, I would like to stage it with just light, like a ballet, so you can have simultaneous scenes going on. That then meant that we could have the figures from the past who were in our show, but we had dealt with it in another way, simultaneously on the stage. Then Michael Bennett suggested that the ghosts of the show, people who were not characters in the show, should go through the show atmospherically. So the combination of the lighting that Hal was talking about, this, which allowed us to play scenes simultaneously. So while you and I are talking, our younger selves are talking over there, and you don't need a different set. And then the notion that while we're doing that, behind you there are just shadowy figures who are pieces of scenery. The showgirls' ghosts were pieces of scenery. The characters' ghosts were their younger selves. So there are two levels of old figures in it. Before we brought it to Hal, it started out as a sort of a who'll do it, not a whodunit, in which we brought four characters together to a party who'd had complicated relationship in the past, and their old angers and insecurities and passions are reignited at this reunion. And at the end of the first act, they each had reason to wish one of the others was dead. So the so-called suspense was who's going to attempt to kill who. And then we gradually realized that every time in each rewrite, that every time we would read each version, and it was too plotted. And so we would take out a little of the plot and just have party. And then it still was too plotted. And we finally woke up to the fact that we should have no plot at all. It should just be these emotional relations at a party. They all get drunk. They, however, we resolve or don't resolve them, and they go home. That's what it shares with Company, is neither of those shows has a plot. They're entirely different as structures and entirely in every way, except neither of them has a plot. They both have stories, but no plots. To start with James Lapine, who I'd seen a play that he wrote and directed called 12 Dreams, and was knocked out by it and wanted to collaborate with him. And by coincidence, he wanted to collaborate with me, and we were brought together by a producer named Lou Allen. And James was of a generation below me, and not just in age, but in approach to theater. He came from off-Broadway. That's where his stuff was done. The plays had been done. And a much more loose, I won't say improvisatory, because his plays are very carefully written, but in not-for-profit theater, you don't worry so much about how the audience is going to react. You want to absorb them, make them absorbed in the piece. But we had to get to know each other, and we discussed movies we liked. We realized that we operate on the same levels in many ways. And he had been a photographer and a graphics designer, and he would bring up photographs, some which he'd taken, some which he'd taken out of magazines, and just spread them out on the floor just to see how they abutted, which is exactly the reverse of how I'd ever, I'd been trained to start with a story and you begin at the beginning, but what he was doing was taking off from his imagination and seeing what would suddenly strike us. And one evening we got to discussing, he had used this painting, the Surratt painting, in a play, so-called, he did by Gertrude Stein, called Photograph, which is actually just a one-page scenario for a possible play. And we started talking about it, and I said, that whole thing's always looked like a stage set to me. And it also had started because he asked me what kind of show I might want to write. And I said, I want to write a theme and variations, which is the kind of show I've always wanted to write. And I brought him a magazine called Bizarre, which is variations on the Mona Lisa. So we started talking about variations. And we started talking about this set. And James said, do you realize nobody in that picture, and there are 48 people or 50 people, is looking at anybody else? Why is that, do you suppose? Perhaps they're hiding from each other, and perhaps they're having illicit affairs, perhaps. And then he said, the main character's missing. I said, who? And he said, the artist. And once he said that, it was, again, the light bulb went off, and we knew we had a play in mind, because it's about a man who controls a landscape and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how it started. And then we just wrote. The other interesting thing was that Pointillism does exactly what we were trying to do what Pointillism does, which is to take this image and that image, meaning emotional images, character, etc., and make them so they all finally come together and make a whole that tells a story. Very few people liked the show. We were sneered at a great deal by the newspapers and by the public. Frank Rich, the critic for the New York Times, liked it a lot. He did not give it a rave on the opening night, but he was stimulated by it, and he kept coming back to see it and writing about it. So it became a sort of pet of the New York Times, which also raised a lot of hackles. But audiences were baffled by it. Many were. A number of walkouts. And the Tonys, but the Tonys ignored West Side Story. The Tonys ignored Gypsy Eye. So we were disappointed, I suppose, by the Tonys because it's a kind of public humiliation. But no, I had no idea. You have to be submitted for the Pulitzer, and unbeknownst to us, a choral director whom I know had submitted us. James was doing we were planning a revival, a revised version of Merrily We Roll On, which he was to direct, because Merrily We Roll On had been this gigantic failure. And James had liked it, liked the score anyway, and also the book. And he had some ideas as what George Firth, the book writer, and I should do to clarify and improve things in the first half hour, particularly. So he arranged to have it done out at La Jolla, and we were planning it one afternoon. We were having a production meeting, and the phone rang, and my informant, whoever it was, said, "Guess what? You've just won the Pulitzer Prize." And I wrote it on a piece of paper because James was, talking to a set designer and all that, and I just slipped it in front of him. I wish I could say there was some great dramatic reaction. There wasn't. He just opened it, and he said something, "Oh, that's nice," or something, and went right on. Of studio. I now have a house in Connecticut as well as a place in New York, and so I have a studio in each place, and that's where I live my life. It's pleasanter to work in the country, where it's quiet and where you can wander out among the trees, but I don't get as much work done. And in the city, there's more pressure. You don't want to leave the room because there's all that chaos going on, and so it's more like a monk's cell, in the sense that you're isolating yourself from the world, and that, I think, leads to more work. It's like doing homework. If you're forced not to leave a room, and of course I'm not forced, but I mean, think of it as a force, as something keeping me in the room, you eventually get bored enough so you put the pencil to paper. I use Blackwing pencils. Blackwings, they don't make them anymore. And luckily I bought a lot of boxes of them. They're very soft lead. They're not round, so they don't fall off the table, and they have removable erasers, which unfortunately dry out. Yellow line pads, I used to have them, so it was, I think, 26 lines. And my friend Bert Shevelov, who was a stationery freak, said, "Buy cartons of them." I said, "Oh, Bert, come on, I'll buy 12 pads, it'll be enough." I mean, God. Well, was he ever right? Because they discontinued making them about 20 years ago. And now, I'm used to the other pads now, but when you get used to the exact amount of space between lines, because, you write a word and then you write an alternate word over it, you want enough room so you can read it, so lines can't be too close. But if they're too far apart, you don't get enough lines on the page. I could go on. It's all, I'm sure many writers have these tiny little habits. And there is a whole community of people, I shouldn't say community, there is, all over the United States, there are people who only use Blackwings, and who I sometimes get letters, "Do you have any source for the Blackwings?" They're extinct. And Adam Green, Adolph Green's son, has written an article for the New Yorker, which I think will be published next year, quite a long article on the Blackwing pencil and the fanatics who go crazy when they don't have a Blackwing in their hand. You just get habituated. Of course you can write. If I were forced, if there were no yellow pads in the world, I'd find a way of writing on white paper, or on non-lined pads. It's the lined pads that make it. Yellow is just good because of the contrast of yellow and the black lead. Is just easier on the eyes than white. one of the hardest things about writing lyrics is to make the lyrics sit on the music in such a way that you're not aware there was a writer there, and that sounds natural. Well, that means things like inflection, the elongation of syllables. Now, I'm talking about a certain kind of songwriting. You know, opera librettists and opera composers will take a word and do a whole melisma on it because it's not about the language. It's about the voice and music. But if you're dealing with a musical in which you're trying to tell a story that is like a play, and particularly if you're trying to tell a contemporary one or something in the last 50 years, it's got to sound like speech. And in order not to sound so song-like that you lose the scene. At the same time, it's got to be a song in the sense that I loathe the recitative, and so it should have a form, and I think the form is what gives it power, and the more formal, in a sense, the song is. So you have to juggle all those things, and that's hard work. That's really hard. And usually it doesn't come out quite the way you want it. That may be true. Maybe all writers would say it never comes out the way you want it. It's particularly noticeable in a lyric because the form is so short. You know, you got 50 words. One of them out of place is like having a novel with 1 out of 50 chapters out of place. But you got 49 long chapters, so that doesn't, but in a short period of time, it stands out, the wrong word. And because each word becomes so important. Every writer that I know of, that I've ever spoken to, feels fraudulent in some way or other. You know, you don't feel it all the time, but particularly if you're successful, or rather, if people admire you a lot, it's not even success. That increases the sense of fraudulence. Hey, I'm not that good. You know, stop comparing me to so and so, and then you do feel fraudulent. Because sometimes you can be so self-critical, you take the blood out of a piece. And that is often a danger. Or you can be Thomas Wolfe and just collect all the stuff in a box and have Maxwell Perkins do it for you. So, you know, there are extremes. Those books are good and rich and full of life. And, you know, he had an editor who really took what he had and formed it, or helped form it anyway. And they're full of blood in life, you know. So maybe if he'd been self-critical, it wouldn't be as good. The worst thing you can do to censor yourself is the pencil hits the paper. It's particularly true in lyric writing because things become, you know, it's easy for a novelist to say, I love you. You know, it's 3 words out of 300,000. But if that is in your lyric and you think, oh, Jesus, I can't say, no, that's just too flat and it's too clear. Well, if you start thinking that way, you won't write anything. And so, yeah, I know it from myself. That's why I in teaching, I always emphasize it because it takes one to know one. It's that moment you must not edit until you get it all on paper. If you can possibly put everything down stream of consciousness, no matter how cliched it may seem, you'll do yourself a service. My mother lived quite a long time. Yeah, she lived until the early 90s. My father, unfortunately, he died when he was 70, and that was 1965. So the only music he ever heard of mine on the stage was Forum and Anyone Can Whistle. He never heard anything. The last thing he heard, I think, was Do I Hear Waltz? My mother was supportive of me once she found out that I was now hobnobbing with Leonard Bernstein and all the celebrities, and then she thought it was fine. But my father was indeed proud of me, although he had been not terribly supportive when I first started out. I lived on a scholarship the first 2 years out of college, and that bothered him a lot, that I wasn't earning a living, capital E, capital L. And he did his best to make me feel guilty about that. Not consciously, but he nattered. And but when I got my first job in television, and I was actually earning a living as a professional writer, he relaxed. And then, I'll tell you an anecdote. So I got the job writing West Side Story, and he asked to read the script because he said I could get some friends and we could invest. He'd never invested in a show before. And I said, "Oh, you don't have to do that." And he said, "Oh, I'd like to read the script." And I gave it to him. And I was sitting in the living room, and he came out of the bedroom where he'd been reading it, and his face was the color of that paper. And he said, "Not a lot of laughs, are there?" I said, "No, Dad, please, you don't have to invest in this show. He said, "No, no, no." And he and some friends invested $1,500, which in those days it was a $300,000 budget, and that was called a percent, even though it's only 0.5%. It's a percent because of the way you have limited partnership and general partnership. But I'm glad he did. What's happened nowadays is you can't have personal investors anymore because it's too expensive, and so you have to have corporate investment, or a lot of rich people. Nowadays you look at the producers of musical. There are sometimes more producers than there are people in the cast, because it takes that much money to put a show on. Yeah, there are fewer new shows. Also, shows run a much longer time now, so the theaters are filled for many, many years. Whereas when the periods we're talking about, a big hit would run maybe 3 years. So there was a turnover in theaters. So that's another thing. And then the taste, the dumbing down of the country reflects itself on Broadway, and the shows get, dumber. And compendium shows, pop songs that they're familiar with, rather than having to listen to new stuff. And it becomes, used to be in New York about 10 years ago, that 2 out of every 3 theater goers were local, meaning from the tri-state area, let's call it. Now, it's 2/3 are tourists, and 1/3, because people come to New York to see a hit show, which is going to cost them a lot of money because the tickets are expensive, and make a real night out. But it means 1 show, and maybe 2. And they're not going to see the new experimental musical down the block. They're going to go see Spamalot, or something that is hard to get a ticket for, and that has a reputation of people liking it. When Hal and I were growing up, and Mike, and Jerry Herman and Bach and Harnick, there was no such thing as off-Broadway. You either got your show on or you didn't get it on. Now there's regional theater and off-Broadway, and as a young writer, you can get your show on. Now, you can't get it on with a 25-piece orchestra, but then you can't get on with a 25-piece orchestra on Broadway either, because that's too expensive, the way they used to when I grew up. But you don't you won't get your spectacular settings, but you can get a show that, if it catches on at all, will transfer to Broadway or be done. You can make a living out of it because it'll be done. Fantastics never got to Broadway, but it made Schmidt and Jones very rich people. So there's another door, there's another entrance, and they came in an era when off-Broadway was starting to attract. They're just that generation younger, or half a generation younger. So that is the one thing that young writers can do. On the other hand, young writers, and why not? Everybody would like to be on Broadway, because if your show works, you make a great deal of money, and it allows you to write other shows. Most of them have to, if they don't have second jobs, they have to write for television or movies if they can get those jobs, or form their own rock bands. I served on the board of, I can't remember what it was officially called. Anyway, it was an organization formed by a Broadway producer named Stuart Ostrout to encourage young writers, musicals. And so they would send in submissions, and there was a panel of us, and we would vote, and if one was decided on, Stuart would produce it off-Broadway or would sponsor it off-Broadway to raise the money. Only one, the organization did not last very long. I think only 1 show came out of it. But among the shows that passed the desk, I looked at one, and the title page said Assassins. I thought, I just immediately thought, that's a musical, without knowing anything about it, by a man named Charles Gilbert. And I opened up, and it was essentially a tale of a soldier who comes back from Vietnam, and he's politicized and becomes an assassin, trying to assassinate. I'm not sure if it was the president. I think it was. At any rate, along with this story, which is really one of paranoia, there was a sort of Sidney Greenstreet figure who would appear for sort of the spirit of evil, who would appear sporadically and read quotations from various politicians' letters. I don't think they were all presidents, but anyway. So it was interspersed with history. And it wasn't for us. We decided not to do it. But many years later, I was talking to John Wyman. We had written together, and we wanted to write something else together. And I mentioned this to him, and his eyes lit up, and he got it right away, the way I did. And he said, "I don't know what it is, but that's a great idea." I said, "Let me see if I can track down Charles Gilbert." And I did, and I wrote him a letter. I said, "Could we use your idea? We won't use your show, just the idea of Assassins." And to my delighted surprise, he said, "Absolutely, providing that it doesn't ever prevent me from putting my show on if I can find a way to put it on." I said, "Absolutely not." And he's a musician. He teaches in Philadelphia, and he's also pit pianist. And anyway, he's an accomplished guy. And so we first decided that we would do Assassination starting right with Julius Caesar and right on up, just the whole idea of assassins from the world. And we realized it was too unwieldy, so then we decided just to use American assassins, but include things like Harvey Milk and John Lennon. And then we decided that was too unwieldy, so we eventually narrowed it down to just presidential assassins. And as it is, we don't cover them all. There are 3 assassinations we don't attempt that we don't cover. My personal life and my artistic life do not interfere with each other. But there are people. I think it's particularly true, now that I've said it, particularly true of performers because they're whisked away from their families, particularly if you're a stage performer in the old days when you used to go on the road. Or, Audra McDonald's out here doing this concert and then doing a Porgy and Bess concert. And she's got a family, she's got kids, and she's away from her family now for 2 weeks. Or 3 weeks, And for those artists, performers who make movies and live on the East Coast, of course, it's very disruptive. It's fun. If you like doing it, otherwise why are you doing it? It's finishing the hat. It's all in finishing the hat. It's all about trancing out. And when you trance out properly, when the writing it's not necessarily going well, but when you're completely in that world, there is no other world. And so there's no conflict. Song in the Park with George. It's a song that the Surratt character sings about, because he is having trouble balancing his life with his mistress, who's in bed in the other room, waiting for him to stop and come to bed, and he can't stop, and she resents it, and he knows that, and he's thinking while he's doing it, and so that kind of complicated feeling.